Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Masterclass, which is Discovery that Builds the Business Case. The conversation is the actual value. Now, discovery in sales is universally known to be the most critical conversation that you have with your client. And it is the non-negotiable conversation that you must have. Knowing this, it is still the stage that is perhaps most consistently rushed, mishandled, or even bypassed on occasion. And the consequence of poor discovery is effectively that buyers disengage mid-process. Sales cycles start to extend, opportunities stall, or momentum simply fades. Now, the salesperson's instinct is naturally to blame the solution that they're selling. It's to blame the timing. It's to blame the market. The client didn't know what they wanted. But the real failure point is actually the conversation that they were having with the buyer in the first place. Now, this session isn't about questioning technique. It's about rethinking what good discovery is actually for. What I find is that most sales teams are actually solving the wrong problem. And the question I really want you to think about is whether you are solving that wrong problem for your buyer, for your client. Now, what often happens is that the buyer describes a challenge. And in my experience, what the buyer often articulates is always a symptom of the bigger, the deeper problem that they really face. Or they are just sharing a little minute piece of the jigsaw, of the scope of challenges or problems or pain points that they actually have. And if a salesperson truly deeply understood the context around those challenges, they would be able to provide a much better service to their clients, to their prospects. The issue is that in discovery, depending on how you handle discovery and how you manage that process, buyers generally tend to only share an element of that information with you. And that's why discovery is such an important part of the sales process. Now, what the consequence of actually only focusing on a small part of the particular challenge is that salespeople, sales organizations, they base their entire pitch, their entire demo, their entire proposal on this reduced lens, this reduced understanding of what the bigger picture actually is. And without that context, they're never ever going to actually be able to really truly deeply align with the buyer. So why does this keep happening? Well, look, it's not a new issue. It keeps happening. But why? Well, in my experience, in my opinion, I think sales teams are under immense pressure to convert and close. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons as to why we have poor discovery in the first place. Okay. Now, what often happens is that salespeople, it doesn't matter at what level you are at, but salespeople more generally hear a problem. They hear a challenge. They hear that trigger. And instantaneously, they are flipping into either a demo mode or a presentation mode or a solutioning mode. And that often happens before the buyer has in real time finished explaining what their issue is in a real deep kind of, to get that deep understanding. Now, from a sales perspective, that conversation feels efficient. The buyer was saying all the things that we know that we can solve. They were ticking all of the boxes. That conversation, it feels so efficient. No objections are raised by the buyer. They're nodding in agreement throughout. And at the end of it, the salesperson thinks, great, this is a really positive opportunity. They understood me, I understood them. Or that's what they've assumed. Because what happens after that initial discovery conversation is that there is complete silence. The buyer goes cold. They probably ghost the seller. And the salesperson is left wondering why. I thought it was a really good conversation. But what actually happened is that the buyer completely disengaged mid-process. They just didn't know how to say no, or they didn't actually know how to challenge the seller in a considered way. Now, this issue is something that I see time and time again. And whenever I am coaching salespeople and I ask them to go through the process, tell me what happened, explain it to me, I ask them questions, I hear the same story over and over again. For me, I don't want to assign any blame as to where this comes from, but this is a structural issue. And that structural issue for me is to do with the amount of pressure that sales teams are currently under with regards to converting and closing deals. Everyone is trying to reduce that cycle time, and that is what is causing this issue, in my opinion. So what's the solution? Well, look, and I think everything starts with your intent. And that ultimately shapes how you're going to have the conversation. So in today's world, buyers do more research than they've ever done. They are more sophisticated than you can imagine. They have more choice, there's more competition, there's more awareness than ever before. It's estimated that before they engage in a sales conversation, they've done between 50 and 70% of their research. Now just think about that, between 50 and 70% of their research. So why does this matter? Well, I think salespeople need to reframe the discovery conversation. Before they actually start asking about discovery, they need to understand what research that buyer has actually done. They need to understand what assumptions or what bias that buyer is entering into the sales conversation with. Now, as a salesperson, if your intent is to sell, your questions become very selective. And essentially, they start amplifying what their solution does first and foremost. And they gloss over what perhaps your solution can't do. Now, buyers know the difference between questions that are actually exploring versus questions that are leading them towards a particular solution. So as a salesperson, your intent is everything. And if your intent is to truly, deeply understand, then the choice of questions that you will ask and how you will manage that discovery process will shine through. And a question I really want you to reflect on when you walk into any discovery conversation is, what is your actual intent? Is your intent to truly, deeply understand, or is your intent to actually want to sell something by the end of that conversation, or to maneuver the prospect, the buyer, the client in a particular way? What is your intent when you are going through a discovery conversation? Now, why am I asking that question? I'm asking it because I passionately believe that discovery is a two-way process. It should create desire on both sides, not just lots of data and lots of insight. Now, why do I passionately believe this? Because one of the biggest challenges that I see is that most salespeople treat discovery as an information gathering exercise. It's a fact find before they're able to actually pitch to their clients. Real discovery is a two-way process, and it should create commercial clarity for both organizations. For you as a salesperson, actually to understand the real essence and context around your client's challenges, but it should create that same level of clarity for the buying organization as well, for the stakeholder that you are interacting and engaging with. As a salesperson, you want to help the buyer, the stakeholder, understand their challenge in a much deeper, more meaningful way. Because great discovery doesn't just find that problem or the root cause of that problem. It actually helps to create the desire within the buyer and their organization to want to fix it as well. And for me, this is why emotion plays a big part of it. Because if the buyer can articulate their challenge and the impact that the solution can have in their words, the conversation becomes the reference point for everything that follows from a selling perspective. And it is that starting point that ultimately, for me, builds the business case. Okay, so great discovery for me is about education. And this is what ultimately separates what poor or average discovery is versus what really good initiative taking discovery conversations are all about. Okay. Now, when a buyer arrives anchored to a particular solution, to a particular challenge, actually, they're just focused on that one element as well. They make assumptions in the same way that salespeople do as well. And as a salesperson, remember, it is your role to help the buyer to see their situation from perhaps a different lens, a different perspective to how they're currently seeing it. It is the salesperson's responsibility to ask those questions that are going to get underneath the cause of the issue. And whoever's asking the questions is ultimately in control of that conversation. And that will help a salesperson to determine actually how real an opportunity it is. Now, one of the most important things that a salesperson can help a buyer do when they're educating them is to help them to visualize that future. What does that ideal solution situation look like if, once the ideal service solution, whatever, is in actual place? They've got to actually help them understand what that cost of inaction is. Perhaps, in a sense, what they're doing is they're helping the buyer to connect the dots that they haven't already seen yet. And that's what great discovery does. It helps to educate and not just talk about the superficial or surface level issues that may be discussed, but this is about really deeply understanding the interconnected nature and the context of the bigger issues that may be apparent as well. And for me, this is where discovery becomes really strategic. And ultimately, this is where a salesperson's credibility is either built or lost. So with that in mind, what does good discovery actually look like? Well, it isn't about script. It is about going to the fundamentals and some good discipline, some basic discipline, I would say. So I want you to imagine a funnel. And at the top of that funnel, it's very broad. And in the same way, when you enter into a discovery conversation, you want to ask some very open, broad questions. Those broad questions are going to open that conversation up. In a sense, you want to understand the wider nature of the issues, the challenges, the pains, the objectives, right? And by doing that, it's about understanding context. It's about understanding their world, what's going on. How are some of these issues, challenges, pain points, objectives all interconnected? Now, once you do that, you can actually then seek to understand and get the client to prioritize which one of those challenges, pains, issues, whatever, is most relevant to them, is most important to them. And then once you've done that, you can start narrowing in and talking about that particular element in more detail. When you do that, there's two things that I like to focus on. I always want to understand cause and effect. So what is the cause of that particular pain, challenge, objective being there? And what is the impact of it on the business today? How does it show up in the business? And then finally, the third critical part of this is, how do you measure it? How do you know that it is a big issue? And generally, that's going to have some form of impact in terms of money value, right? Does it cost? Is there a monetary value in terms of cost? Is there a time value? Because all of these elements can be quantified and you can actually use it to build that business case. Now, the questions that you ask will feel sometimes that uncomfortable. Your clients will actually sometimes be unsure as to how to answer them. And that's okay. It's absolutely okay. Because what you're really doing here is, through this process, you're helping to educate them that actually they might not have understood the issue as deeply either. And through the process, what you're doing is that you are showing them that all of these issues are interconnected in some which way, shape, or form. So it isn't just about solving one issue, it's about looking at the issues, the challenges holistically, and then actually tackling each one and saying, well, okay, if we solve one or two of these, this is the net impact. So that's how you open that conversation up. That's how you build your broader business case. Okay. The key to this is that the buyer, the stakeholder, the client is the one that is doing the most talking. Okay, that's the key thing. And it's about the words and language that they're using. As a salesperson, you want to listen and you want to make notes and you want to capture that information in the language that the buyer is sharing with you. So there is a structure. There is a framework that I like to use when I am having discovery conversations. You guys probably all already know it, but you may not have seen it presented in this particular way. The framework I like to use is called 5W1H, and that essentially stands for who, what, why, when, where, and the H is for how. Now, great discovery conversations feel natural and they flow. But that naturalness is a consequence of deliberate preparation. And I like to think about asking questions around this 5W1H framework. So I mentioned the funnel. At the top of the funnel, I like to ask really open questions. So what are some of the challenges? What are some of the pains? What are some of your strategic objectives? And I really want to try and open that conversation up. Now, once I understand those challenges, I can start narrowing. And I use the other types of questions when I'm actually focusing on narrowing the issue. So why is that particular issue really important? Okay, who is involved in that particular area of the business? When does it actually happen? You always talk about timing. And where does it show up? So you've got to start using this framework to start structuring the type of questions that you have. And finally, the how is the how does it show up? Because once you understand the how, you understand the process flow as well. Now, the questioning structure should be invisible to your client, but the preparation behind it as a salesperson is what is critical. Okay, so for me, when you do discovery well, it practically writes the business case for you, because the buyer is the one that has ultimately shared all of this information with you. Your consequential pitch, the demo that you have, the proposal that you share, ultimately is replaying what you've captured in your discovery conversation. Right? So that's the reason why I think the discovery conversation is the most critical conversation that you have with your prospects, your buyers, and your clients. Because if the buyer articulates the issue, the root cause in their own words, if they help you to understand what that quantifiable impact is, what the consequence of inaction is, ultimately they are giving you all of the information to build that business case and to validate why this is a no-brainer for them. Okay, what happens if you do that is that the objections around the solution, etc., will diminish. You will naturally find that any objections that they have are more related to payment terms, to contractual elements, to perhaps the investment value, than around your solution or actually needing to fix that particular challenge that they have. Now, one key point here, discovery doesn't end after that initial discovery meeting. It is a continuous process. It is a process that you follow through with every stakeholder that you interact with, because you are always validating, you are always building your understanding of those particular issues. The person that you dealt with may have articulated the issue from their lens. Another person in the organization will have a different opinion on it. So you are constantly capturing information and validating what you have already understood as part of the initial discovery process. Okay. So with that in mind, I leave you with these three takeaways from today's session. Firstly, diagnose before you prescribe. You've got to listen intently and always seek to understand before showing any kind of capability or solution to your clients. Secondly, consider the questions that you are asking during discovery and whether they enable you to understand and explore the cause and effect relationship between the two, or between the challenges. And finally, in professional selling, the conversation that you're having with your buyer, your client, is where the value really is. And discovery is where that value is either created or lost. So guys, thank you so much for attending. I will take any questions that you have now, and I look forward to speaking with you guys again. Thank you very much.